Thank you very much to Khaki Labs and to Diksha and Farooq for inviting me to present this talk. Like she mentioned, I'm very interested in early anti-colonial figures and have recently, in the last several years, have been writing on a few of them, some of them who are not very well known. Today in this talk, I would like to explore a few stories of the 1920s of anti-colonial activists and other kinds of agitators and revolutionaries, including some unusual figures, editors of newspapers, whose efforts challenged the British establishment greatly. So if you could put up slide 1, please, Diksha.
Oh, yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So as you can see, Bombay during that period, apart from Calcutta, was known as the gateway of India. A large number of people came into Bombay and dispersed into different places. It was an extremely active port, and of course, so it saw a lot of traffic. On the morning of 19th September 1922, a 30-year-old British man disembarked at Bombay port, having traveled on the SS Pilsner from Europe. That particular steamer would become famous a decade later when Mahatma Gandhi was photographed at its steering wheel on his way back to India from the Round Table Conference of 1931. The next slide, please. So you can see here an image of the Pilsner. And the man's baggage was searched and nothing of any concern was found, but the authorities did not search his person. As intelligence reports reveal, the Bombay police had received cipher communication, late on 15th September from the director of the Intelligence Bureau to search the person, quote, if a suitable pretext could be found, unquote. An additional message on 16th September from the director of Intelligence Bureau revealed that the man was carrying 3 letters for 3 Bengali men. Instructions specified, quote, no other action other than placing him under secret surveillance is advisable, unquote. The very same day, further communications were received from the empire-wide endorsement on the man's passport had been cancelled, that the man's passport had been cancelled, and the commissioner of police was to wait instructions from the Bombay government. Next slide, please. You can see a telegram here from the Secretary of State on your screen regarding the impending arrival of Charles Ashley. This cancellation was prompted of his empire-wide endorsement on the passport, was prompted by an urgent coded cable on 13th September from the Foreign Office to His Majesty's Consul General in Marseille, requesting that immediate action should be taken to track the man who was to sail soon to India. It further added that the passenger in question should be informed that he would not be allowed to land in India. This interception did not take place, and the man successfully landed in Bombay. Frantic and urgent communications ensued between London, Shimla, and Bombay in the intervening period to ensure that Bombay police also cancelled the empire-wide endorsement on their end and take action to ensure his immediate removal from the city. The next slide, please. You can see the follow-up telegram from the Secretary from Bombay to the Secretary Government of India. And the next slide, please. This is a picture of Charles Ashley, who is the man in question who arrived secretly to Bombay. Intelligence had it that Charles Ashley, or John Ashworth, as he was also known, was a Bolshevik, a Comintern activist. Comintern is a shortened form for Communist International, a Moscow-sponsored organization to spread communism around the world that came into being in 1920, soon after the Russian Revolution. Intelligence had it that he was an agent representing the Third International, which was Comintern. He had left Berlin on 25th August and had been in touch with the Indian revolutionary figure and founder of the Communist parties of India and Mexico, M.N. Roy, who was at the center of the British establishment's attention and fear with regard to communist anti-British activities in relation to India. Ashley was traveling to India under the guise of a journalist carrying 3 letters of introduction from a man called Nalini Gupta, an associate of M.N. Roy in Berlin, who was known for his expertise in bomb making. One for Muzaffar Ahmad of Calcutta, who was described as a new but prominent conspirator. Another for Kiran Chandra Roy, who was actually, his name was misspelled. He was actually Kiran Bihari Roy, the chief accountant of the Tata Assurance Company in Bombay. And a third for a P.N. Roy, who was also misidentified in the note. He was actually Dr. Tejendra Nath Roy, who was the brother of J.N. Roy, a famous barrister. Ashley had traveled from Trieste with a valid passport and was therefore allowed to land in Bombay. There was no provision within the framework of these facts to arrest him or search his person, as revealed by intelligence notes on the inquiry into this incident the following year. Ashley was taken to the Bombay CID, where he revealed that he was a journalist traveling to India to write some, quote, color stuff, which readily sells in America, unquote, and claimed that he had sent some stories to the New York Globe from Port Said on his way to Bombay. Interestingly, he informed the police that Rudyard Kipling's book, Sea to Sea, was the inspiration for his India tour, and that he did not write political pieces, but only what he saw. Ashley was allowed to remain in Bombay for a few days till he was able to board the Kaisar-e-Hind on 23rd September. The next slide, please. Ashley checked into the fancy Majestic Hotel at Colaba. He then proceeded to surreptitiously conduct a few meetings, deliver the letters he was carrying on his person, and thereby become the first of several British emissaries of the Comintern to travel to India to establish direct contact with Indian communists. He managed to do all this evading the watchful eyes of the Bombay police minders. Indeed, the confidential report from the Bombay CID dated 28 September indicates that Ashley's passport was duly cancelled by the passport officer, and that, quote, there was nothing suspicious about Ashley's movements while in Bombay, and so far as appeared on the surface, he was what he alleged himself to be, a journalist who had come to write articles for the American press on India, unquote. As intelligence documents reveal, Ashley had befriended a major while on his journey. The latter had a room at the Majestic Hotel, and this was the reason that the alleged notorious Bolshevik also joined him there for a few days. For the few days he was allowed to remain in Bombay. But there was another motive, which is revealed in the account of Muzaffar Ahmad, one of the founding members of the Communist Party of India, who Ashley was supposed to have met on this trip to India. Next slide, please. This is Muzaffar Ahmad. Ahmad surmises very plausibly, that Ashley gave over the, quote, letters, documents, and surplus money that he had on him, unquote. As Ahmad writes, the money, which was 800 pounds, which was revealed by the British spy Masood Ali Shah, who was later executed by the Russians on account of being a British spy, that Ashley was carrying for the purpose of the passage of possible delegates for the upcoming 4th Congress of Comintern in Moscow. So the money was intended to use it as passage for attendees, delegates from India. Ashley gave the police watchers the slip and attempted to meet Kiran Bihari Roy, who, as per Ahmad's account, was scared and refused to meet him. Ashley then went to the offices of the then controversial nationalist newspaper, the Bombay Chronicle, and met its editor, Marmaduke Pickthall, a prominent British journalist, writer, and strong advocate, passionate advocate of Turkey and Islamic causes. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Marmaduke Pickthall. Earlier that year, in April 1922, Marmaduke Pickthall had addressed a public gathering at the Bombay Parsi Assembly Hall. He strongly advocated that Indian Muslims stand behind Turkey in their hour of need and fulfill their obligation, quote, to restore the Jaziratul Arab to the Khilafatul Muslimin, to restore, which means to restore the peninsula, the peninsula of the Arabian Peninsula to the congregation of Muslims under the Caliph, under the Turkish Caliph. The British policy of craftily repudiating its earlier promises made by the then Prime Minister Lloyd George and the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres had served to humiliate Turkey, take away its control of the holy cities of the Arabian Peninsula, undermine the temporal and spiritual authority of the Ottoman Caliphate, thereby causing further divisions in the Muslim world as Pickthall saw it. The next 2 slides, please, if you can. You can see the location of the TT of the land. There are indications here of the different kinds of divisions of the land and of what Turkey lost, and some of the annulled boundaries and the plebiscite sites. So Turkey felt greatly humiliated by this action, and it lost significant territory as a consequence of the Treaty of Sèvres. Attempting to strike a fine balance of political positions, not to mention loyalties, Pickthall said to those gathered that there had been criticism that the Bombay Chronicle, quote, under my tenure has become a Khilafat paper. He added further, hoping to harness some transnational support, that the newspaper report from Port Said had said that Mahatma Gandhi's actions in supporting the Khilafat movement was not just for Hindustan, but for the entirety of Asia. And said it is because of Khilafat that this is a quote, it is of Marmaduke Pickthall, it is because of the Khilafat that the whole of the East, in its quest for freedom, will consider Hindustan its guide, unquote. The opportune melding of nationalist and Khilafatist interests, which had found wider sanction, both political and theological, deeply disturbed the British establishment. Pickthall spoke openly of Swaraj and reportedly wore the white Gandhi dress with the Khilafat badge on his cap at public functions. The scholar M.A. Sharif, who has explored these details at length in his work, adds that Pickthall's politics were at the time located at the intersection of the overlapping circles of the Indian Khilafat movement, the Hindu-Muslim nationalist solidarity, and Asiatic anti-colonialism and Muslim internationalism. Next slide, please. This is an image of the Bombay Chronicle and of a meeting that Pickthall addressed on it was reported on 31st July 1922. Pickthall was quite unhappy in London in the period leading up to his move to Bombay in mid-1920. He had left his position at the Islamic Information Bureau and his role of editor of its weekly paper, The Muslim Outlook, in December 1919 due to differences with his colleague Mushir Hussain Kidwai, the writer and barrister. Since before the First World War and through its course, Pickthall had not just been regarded with suspicion, but had also been actively vilified, particularly since the public announcement of his conversion to Islam in 1917. The authorities viewed him as a security risk, and one intelligence report described an article of his in 1917 as, quote, a masterpiece of enemy propaganda, unquote. British intelligence closely watched the Islamic Information Bureau and Pickthall and his Indian Muslim associates, who were all under surveillance. Dubbed by the authorities as the Walking Mosque Gang, they were considered dangerous anti-British agitators who were collaborating with conspirators in Britain and abroad. In fact, the Walking Mosque and the activities, which is in London, in the area of Walking, and the activities of the Turkophile Islamic Society and the Anglo-Ottoman Society were under surveillance since 1914. As the Khilafat movement gathered momentum, and what with the British rejection of the demands of the Indian Khilafat delegation to London in 1920, Pickthall's reputation was further under attack as he began to be described as a quote, enemy of Christendom, unquote. In the lead up to the Treaty of Sèvres, Pickthall realized that his efforts to bring a rapprochement between Britain and Turkey had failed. Adding to all this in a significant way was the role of Bolshevik Russia following the October Revolution of 1917. Under the chairmanship of Pickthall, the Anglo-Ottoman Society had reached out to the provisional government in Russia in the hope that they would recognize the independence of progressive Turkey. The next slide, please. This is a very interesting picture, which is of the group of individuals associated with the provisional government of India, which was established in Kabul in 1915, with Raja Mahendra Pratap Singh as the president, Maulana Barkatullah as the prime minister, Deobandi Maulvi Ubaidullah as home minister, Deoband Maulvi Bashir as war minister, and Champakaraman Pillai as the foreign minister. During this period, Central Asia and Afghanistan emerged as a staging ground for these interesting conflicts. In December 1915, the Provisional Government of India was established by the revolutionary group, the Berlin Committee in Kabul, while activists there made plans in collaboration with the Indo-German Turkish mission led by Oscar von Niedermeyer to mobilize against the British. Afghanistan had become a convenient location for several Indian nationalists and Muslim agitators as after effects of the Great Game, which is the which is the political battle between Britain and other allies of Europe and the Russian Empire, the British Empire and the Russian Empire for control of Central Asia. Russian interests in Central Asia and their efforts to control Turkestan further complicated this already dense matrix of interests and conflicts. The next slide, please. This is a slide just to illustrate another aspect of this broad global revolutionary network. This is of the Hindu-German conspiracy of 1919-1920, and the case of which was tried in San Francisco. Several individuals are arrested and were tried, and it was quite a dramatic case. Many Indian revolutionary figures in the United States, including the Ghadar revolutionaries of the Ghadar party, were being actively surveilled by British and American authorities. And the case was a result of widespread surveillance during that period. Following his father's death, I would like to take a small digression here just for the interest of the listeners and mention some of the, very briefly, the background of Afghanistan at that point. Following his father's death in February 1919, the young Amir of Afghanistan, Amanullah Khan, began quoting Russian, Central Asian, Pashtun tribal and Indian Muslim leaders to facilitate his ambitions for an independent Afghanistan and a somewhat unrealistic one of Afghan-led pan-Islamism. Soon the Third Anglo-Afghan War erupted as the Amir tried to capitalize on the civil unrest following the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and leverage his tenuous position as best he could. But when he issued an announcement that Afghanistan would receive Indian Muslims who desired to move in a political religious act of hijrat, he probably did not anticipate the exodus that it would precipitate. The next slide, please. You can see two slides there, two images here on the slide, which show the exodus of Indian Muslims to Afghanistan on the invitation of Amir Amanullah Khan. A small number of the nearly 40,000 migrants or muhajirin who emigrated to Afghanistan sought passage to Turkey to fight for the cause of the caliphate. They instead found themselves thick in the middle of the Central Asian proxy battles between Bolshevik-backed groups and the British-backed militia. It is well known that some of these muhajirin came to be aligned with the Bolsheviks, were taken to Tashkent, where under the leadership of M.N. Roy, they formed an exile group of the Communist Party of India in October 1920. Driven by pan-Islamist, Khilafatist, Indian nationalist, anti-British, and egalitarian revolutionary ideals, the motley group exemplified the complicated, intersecting, and often contrary political strands that coexisted in a fractious balance. Pickthall's own intersecting politics were bound in kinship to what this motley crew of Muhajirin expressed. But his decision to move to India had a more practical reason. As he revealed to his friend and fellow Turkophile Aubrey Herbert, he needed the money. On his arrival, local British residents received him coldly, and he and his wife were excluded from their social circuit. The Bombay Chronicle had already seen the controversial deportation of its editor, B.G. Horniman, over the reporting of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The next slide, please. You can see an image here of the Horniman's deportation order. The British journalist and writer Valentine Shirall led a frontal attack on Pickthall, calling the Bombay Chronicle, quote, the leading organ of Indian extremism, Hindu and Mohammedan, and now under the editorship of a fervent convert to Islam, unquote. The articles in the paper, Shirall further asserted, were anti-British, glorified the Turks, and incidentally, the Bolsheviks. Pickthall, however, had no sympathies for either Russia or the Bolsheviks. In fact, he was one with the British establishment in regarding Russia and its territorial ambitions as the biggest threat to the empire, regardless of whether it was a Tsarist Russia or a Bolshevik Russia. While there was a general disregard for communism amongst Muslims, some pan-Islamists agreed with Bolshevik anti-imperialism, their rhetoric on oppressed people, and their support for Afghanistan and Turkey. Despite fraught tensions, these associations were plagued with. For Pickthall, though, an empire man, despite being seen as a loyal enemy by the British, the red peril of communism as it was popularly known then, could be averted through a strong Turkey supported by Britain. As regards Muslims, he argued, quote, "It is not for the love of the Bolsheviks, but the hatred and distrust of England, fast becoming general, which constitutes the real danger," unquote. It is against all these complex intersecting strands that the secret undetected meeting between Charles Ashley and Marmaduke Pickthall at the offices of the Bombay Chronicle is particularly intriguing. Muzaffar Ahmad speculates in his account that they may have known each other from before. He adds that that Pickthall called for the trade union activist and communist leader Sriprat Amrit Dange, S.A. Dange, who came to his office on Ashley's request. Then Ashley conveyed the documents, instructions, and money to Dange that he had carried from Berlin. British intelligence had a source in Europe who had provided them information of Charles Ashley's impending travel. They learned of the meeting between Ashley and Pickthall much later, much to their annoyance. Muzaffar Ahmad claims that this source was none other than George Slocum, a British journalist and member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, who had facilitated Charles Ashley's trip to India. While this remains a matter of contention, it can be said that British intelligence had managed to penetrate revolutionary networks successfully. The next slide, please. This is a slide image of Kohinoor Mills of 1918. The cotton mill industry began in India in the 1850s in Bombay. Several mills began to open up in other parts of India over the next 70 years, but the Bombay presidency was home to 75% of the mills. But there was really no trade union presence or activities till 1918, when the strike movement began with the efforts of B.P. Wadia in Madras. As pointed out by other scholars, the early labor movement in India was, quote, soaked in blood, unquote. The textile strike of Bombay of 1919, of workers in numbers of 120,000, 120,000 more, ended with almost 200 workers being shot dead by soldiers. Strikes in other parts of the country also resulted in workers being killed as authorities clamped down brutally on protests. The Punjab Labour Union organized railway workers in 1920 for a strike with over 60,000 in number. Textile and leather workers organized themselves in Kanpur, as did plantation workers in Assam. This is a very quick snapshot of the early times of strikes of that period. The Russian Revolution and other labor and people's movements began to influence Indian activists, and very soon Indian trade unions began to take on revolutionary characteristics. The birth of the Communist Party of India in 1920 in Tashkent, under the leadership of M.N. Roy and his colleagues, and the strong institutional support of Comintern in Moscow, would soon lead to an increase in all this activity. With money, revolutionary messages, and manifestos, trained activists began attempts to radicalize the Indian labor movement with the intention of infiltrating and gaining control of trade unions. Over the course of the 1920s, this would become a reality until the colonial powers struck back forcefully with arrests and conspiracy cases against communist and labor activists. The next slide, please. This is a slide of M.N. Roy M.N. Roy with Vladimir Lenin, Maxim Gorky, Nikolai Bukharin, Georgy Zinoviev, who was the president of the Comintern at that point, and others on 19 July 1920 at the Second World Congress of the Comintern. Some years later, after the secret meeting of Charles Ashley in February 1925, Percy E. Gladding, also whose alias was R. Cochrane, traveled to India using the cover as an agent with the Amalgamated Union of Engineers. Intercepted communications indicated that his purpose was to assess Indian labor conditions and activate a labor party in collaboration with local communists. Gladding made contact with Lajpat Rai, D.P. Sinha, and some others before departing to London in April. He thereafter made a negative report on the presence of committed communists in India, which M.N. Roy was forced to defend. George Allison, formerly a Scottish coal miner, came to India under the cover name of Donald Campbell in April 1926. He remained active and undetected for several months, and it was only in August that year that police heard of him. Following the surveillance and interception of letters, it became clear that he had been sent by the Communist Party of Great Britain with the consent of M.N. Roy, who outlined to an Indian comrade that, quote, His main task is to develop the left wing inside the Trade Union Congress. He has been advised to keep out of party politics, except in an advisory capacity if necessary. Some other comrade, especially charged with this task, will meet you soon if he has not done so already, unquote. Allison successfully traveled across India as Donald Campbell, made contact with several trade unions, including the powerful All India Trade Union Congress, or AITUC. Intelligence reports assigned to him the success of establishing the Workers' and People's Party in Bombay and Calcutta, endeavors in which another figure who would soon follow, Philip Spratt, played an important role as well. The WPP, the Workers' and Peasants' Party that is, and its regional branches, Delhi and Punjab, would be formed soon after, was spearheaded on Roy's prompting in the middle of 1926. He at the time pushed for the WPP as, quote, a temporary alternative to a communist party rather than as a companion organization, and he urged Indian communists to change the name of CPI to the Workers' and Peasants' Party, unquote. Next slide, please. This is an image of Philip Spratt. Philip Spratt landed in Bombay on New Year's Eve of 1926. He was sent to India not because of his fervor or expertise, but mostly because the police did not know him, or so the communist leadership in Great Britain wrongly assumed, since he was already being tracked by British intelligence since his recruitment in college. Recruited by the quietly influential British writer and journalist Clements Palmer Dutt, whose association with M.N. Roy dated back to 1923, and who headed the Colonial Bureau of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which recruited and trained agents to send to India amongst other activities, Philip Spratt was indoctrinated and briefed on his role in secrecy prior to his departure to India in early December 1926. His brief was to ensure that the CPI, the Communist Party of India, established a legal entity in the form of a Workers' and Peasants' Party, WPP, that I just mentioned, which would infiltrate trade unions and gain control of them. The WPP's overt program was to fight for workers' and peasants' rights and the promotion of trade unions, but its ultimate objective was, quote, to obtain Swaraj, wherein the means of production, distribution, and exchange are publicly owned and socially controlled, unquote. This plan was revealed to authorities through intercepted communications of M.N. Roy, who at the time was heading the Foreign Bureau of the Communist Party of India, which was a foreign liaison office between the Comintern in Moscow and Indian communists. Allison and Spratt worked together for a while in Bombay till Allison was arrested in Calcutta on 29 January 1927 on a false passport charge, jailed for 18 months, and then deported to England. However, intelligence showed that the communist agents and Indian colleagues in Bombay and elsewhere in India were able to further Comintern's and M.N. Roy's plans of an expanded and influential communist presence in India by infiltrating trade unions. Next slide, please. This is a British intelligence, drawn from British intelligence assessment, but this is actually an extract from court documents which appeared during the pre-trial hearings of all these activists who were soon to be arrested very dramatically in 1929. In the midst of all this, the British MP and communist leaders Shapoji Saklatwala, the next slide please, there's an image of Saklatwala, traveled to India in January 1927, and with a largely dismissive attitude towards Indian communists, he reluctantly met with them. Intelligence reports did not attach much significance to his visit, despite noting that he traveled across the country and, quote, openly advocated communism as the panacea of Indians' multifarious ills, unquote. According to the Director of Intelligence Bureau, David Petrie's report, Saklatwala disparagingly characterized the Indian Communist Party as, quote, an unrepresentative body infested by spies and agents provocateurs, unquote. It was alleged, though, that he had brought rupees 20,000 to aid the spread of communism in India. Tellingly, as the Director of Intelligence Bureau, David Petrie, notes, quote, Saklatwala arrived in India with a flourish of trumpets, but his departure some months later passed almost unnoticed, unquote. One of the images that you see here, both images are from intelligence documents. The second is from his Saklatwala's MI5 file. The steady flow of British agents continued with the arrival of Benjamin Francis Bradley on 23rd September 1927, a coded message from Clemens Dutt of the Communist Party of Great Britain, written earlier in late July possibly, which later was used as evidence against Bradley, mentioned his impending travel to Glasgow, in quotations, in order to, quote, help the university there as you will be glad to learn, unquote. This was all code. While Glasgow meant Bombay, university referred to the trade unions. Bradley's travel document said he was a colonial agent for the Crab Patent Under the Drain Tile Company. Soon after his arrival, he was elected to the executive committee of the All India Trade Union Congress, AITUC, and a member of WPP, Workers' and Peasants Party, Bombay. This period saw a rapid radicalization of Bombay textile mills, as the members of WPP and others began to take over key positions and exercise control. In due course, the communists gained control of the Girni Kamgar Mahamandal and soon joined up with Jhabwala's, Jhabwala's Bombay Mill Workers Union to form the powerful and iconic Bombay Girni Kamgar Union, or GKU, on 23rd May 1928. Bradley became one of the vice presidents of GKU. The communists were on an ascendancy in Bombay. The next slide, please. In the slide, you see an image of Suhasini Nambiar or Suhasini Chattopadhyay and Lester Hutchinson, who was also a British communist agent who arrived in Bombay. Suhasini Chattopadhyay was the youngest sister, the second youngest sister actually, sorry, of the nationalist leader Sarojini Naidu. She was married to a Berlin-based journalist named ACN Nambiar, and she was the first woman member of the Communist Party of India. Also on the GKU, elected to the GKU as a vice president, was Lester Hutchinson, who appeared in Bombay with Suhasini Nambiar as an unaffiliated activist in the guise of a journalist on 17 September 1928. Prior to his trip, he had visited Berlin and had met ACN Nambiar, that is Suhasini's husband, and soon to become estranged husband. And Suhasini's oldest sibling, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, or Chato. Virendranath Chattopadhyay, popularly known as Chato, was a much wanted man by British intelligence, and he was a revolutionary activist based out of Berlin at that point of time. He eventually moved to Moscow and was put to death by Stalin in 1937. There is no indication, Hutchinson's memoir conceals these details which are borne out by surveillance records and intercepts of the Bombay Special Branch. The details of these intercepts, particularly of the documents on Lester Hutchinson and Suhasini Nambiar's activities, can be found in the book, a biography of ACN Nambiar by a former Indian intelligence officer, Mr. V. Balachandran. I'm the editor of the book. And if listeners here are interested, viewers here are interested, they should look out for this book. It's called A Life in Shadow. It is these links. There's no indication that Lester Hutchinson had any links to the Communist Party of Great Britain, although quite possibly he would have been acquainted with M.N. Roy in Berlin due to his proximity to ACN Nambiar, Suhasini Nambiar, and Chato. It is these links and the fact that he was soon staying with the Chattopadhyay sisters in Khal. Suhasini had a sister here called Mrinalini for some time that are responsible for surveillance on him. She's also seen in this image, which is from the Bombay Special Branch archives. And there was surveillance on all these figures. Aside from trade union activity, Hutchinson was also responsible for the journal called the New Spark, born of a dormant socialist weekly, Spark, edited by M.G. Desai, who once responded to it being called a rag by describing the journal as, quote, soaked in Marxian oil, unquote. The WPP members had made inroads in other cities and other unions, from textile workers in Sholapur and Kanpur, iron and steel workers in Jamshedpur, jute workers in Bengal, and railway workers across the country. Bradley became a vice president of the Great Indian Peninsular Railwaymen's Union. British intelligence assessed this widespread reach as, quote, next slide, please. You can read the quotation. By the end of 1928, there was hardly a single public utility service or industry remained which had not been affected in whole or in part by the wave of communism which swept the country during the year, unquote. Things, however, would unravel soon, quite soon thereafter, following the setting up of the All India Workers and Peasants Party, AIWPP, in late 1928, and an important meeting of the Bombay WPP members in Bombay on 18th March, simultaneous raids were conducted on 20th March by police across the country, and over 31 communist and trade union activists were arrested, including the leadership of the Communist Party of India and the WPP. Spratt and Bradley were arrested as well, and a few months later in June, Lester Hutchinson was arrested in Nagpur. This was a major setback for Indian communists and for M.N. Roy. But the authorities, their case against the accused was, quote, supported by a vast mass of documentary evidence, the likes of which would never have been handled in a single case in the whole history of Indian legal practice. The next slide, please. And you can see an image of all the 31 arrested members. The arrests were a result of an interception, a British intelligence interception in 1928 of a letter by M.N. Roy dated 30th December 1927, which came to be known as the Assembly Letter. The British intelligence saw this as conclusive proof of a widespread conspiracy to deprive the king of his sovereignty and leaked it to the press. Months later, on 10th September 1928, parts of the letter were read out in the Legislative Assembly, while the House debated the Public Safety Removal from India Bill, which was clearly intended to target communists and other dissenters, and which was passed as an ordinance the following summer. The Meerut conspiracy case was the largest of its times. It threw up many controversies, and the curious case of the Russian officer of the Bombay Police Foreign Branch is one of the most interesting cases. I have delved into this fascinating case recently, and you can find that piece on Scroll. It is a piece about the Russian officer, Inspector Derejinsky. I might add, it was a previously untold story. Inspector Boris Derejinsky, or B.W. Derejinsky, formerly a member of the Russian Life Guards, was said to have fled Russia in 1920. He had fought against the Bolsheviks after the 1917 revolution. Facing ruin, the alleged White Guards were anti-Bolshevik militia. Left with his family and arrived in Constantinople, that is Istanbul, in August 1920, whereupon he was employed for 2 years with the British section of the Allied Police Commission. His duties were, quote, were to investigate and report on cases, both civil and criminal and civil, unquote. Given his skill with languages, he acted as an interpreter for the British police on raids. Derejinsky wished to travel onward to Siam, present-day Thailand, where a friend had promised him, a secure job. But due to the cancellation of the transport, he could only make his way to Bombay. He arrived in the city on the troop ship SS Derbyshire on March 26, 1923, with a French laissez-passer, which is a travel document, and a recommendation letter from his former employer to the Bombay governor and the commander-in-chief in Shimla. His request to the authorities for a job was granted since, quote, he is an intelligent young man who claims to be of a good family, unquote. And he was appointed a probationary sergeant on April 5th, 1923, I might add. Derejinsky was appointed initially to the water police, but the department wished that he be inducted into the foreign branch of the Crime Investigation Department, the CID. The Bombay police had faced embarrassment with the Charles Ashley case the previous year, which we have just explored, wherein the British Comintern emissary had slipped past surveillance and conducted his secret meetings. As part of an inquiry, the Commissioner of Police brought up the shortage of qualified European officers of the foreign branch who could operate in a clandestine manner, gathering intelligence, and consequently, Derejinsky's appointment fit well in the circumstances. The next slide, please. Here's an image of the Bombay Chronicle reporting on the Derejinsky case and his deposition before the court in the Meerut conspiracy case. On August 8, 1929, the Bombay Chronicle reported on the deposition of Inspector Derejinsky as a prosecution witness in the Meerut conspiracy case proceedings the previous day. In response to the Crown Counsel, Langford James, the Russian policeman said that he had been in charge of the foreign branch for 6 years and had arrested British Communist Benjamin Francis Bradley on March 24th that year, recovering from him several various documents. The strategy of the defense, though, was to attack the credibility of Dzerzhinsky and impute that he was involved in skullduggery. He was up to no good, basically. Dzerzhinsky responded that he had never been employed by the British Secret Service, did not have any expertise in printing, and had, quote, never forged Russian letters to implicate Indian workers, nor was he aware of anti-Soviet forgeries, unquote. The next day, an explosive report of the court proceedings, next slide, please. The next day, an explosive report of the court proceedings appeared in the Pioneer titled Forging Russian Letters, Defense Allegations in Meerut Case, Cross-Examination of the Bombay Inspector. This deeply disturbed the British authorities. The following day, August 10th, the Pioneer, which is the article that you're seeing on your screen, published an editorial titled Inspector Dzerzhinsky, characterizing him as one of the chief witnesses for the prosecution. It stated that Dzerzhinsky had no passport when he landed in India in 1923, but as preparations for the Meerut arrests were underway in February 1929, 6 years later, he was naturalized as a British citizen. The timing of his being granted British citizenship seemed suspicious, the article hinted, and suggested that this was a quid pro quo for some dubious thing that he would have done, which was later brought up in court hearings as being perhaps manufacturing evidence in the case. The British establishment saw this as a scurrilous ploy to prejudice the public's mind against the trial by misrepresenting Dzerzhinsky's role and casting aspersions on his character. The public prosecutor sought to file a contempt petition against the editor of the Pioneer, F.W. Wilson, saying that the article made, quote, quite definite suggestions that Inspector Dzerzhinsky is a man with a very dubious history, and that one of the principal witnesses is a Russian spy of disreputable antecedents, unquote. On November 14th, the editor of the Pioneer, F.W. Wilson, appeared before a judicial bench headed by the Chief Justice with an affidavit filed by his counsel and friend, Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru, saying that it was not his intention to prejudice a fair trial, and he offered an unqualified apology. As the Meerut conspiracy case unfolded over the next couple of years, a voluminous amount of evidence was presented before the court. This episode gets murkier with the defense statements of Benjamin Bradley, who Dzerzhinsky had searched and arrested. The Bombay Chronicle carried a story on July 3rd, 1931, titled A Mystery of a Letter Not Found But Planted There, Bradley's Allegation, reporting that Bradley had said that a month after his arrest, his landlord had suddenly found a letter in one of the almirahs, this is a quotation, in one of the almirahs used by me, and he, of course, immediately sent this letter to Inspector Dzerzhinsky. The next slide, please. Later that month, even as the court proceedings were ongoing, the Bombay police made the arrest of M.N. Roy in Bombay, bringing to a conclusion a 15-year hunt for him. This proved to be a significant blow to the radical factions of the Indian anti-colonial movement quite drastically. In the meantime, however, the nationalist movement had grown, and Mahatma Gandhi was soon set to attend the Roundtable Conference in London, sailing on the very same steamer that brought Charles Ashley to Bombay. We've seen that picture of Gandhi at the wheel of SS Pilsner at the beginning of this talk. And the next slide, please. This is an image of Ballard Estate. It's quite a significant and interesting image because this became the focal point for a great amount of surveillance during this period. Officers, besides the customs officers and water police and other police officials, there were also officers of the foreign branch of which Dzerzhinsky belonged to, who would make discreet inquiries, often come aboard ships, check the documents of people, visitors, and check their belongings, and often take in people for questioning. The stories and associations that we can glean from intelligence documents, communist sources, and newspaper reports of the times reveal a great deal of complexity in the anti-colonial landscape of Bombay, infested as it was with agitators, revolutionaries, informants, spies, and malcontents of various hues. With that, I conclude this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gautam. I would now like to hand it over to Farooq to take the Q&A part.
Yes, thanks so much. What a fascinating time it must have been for everybody living in that period. How did you get interested in this, Gautam? And tell us about your sort of sources of all this information.
So I briefly mentioned this in the talk, but perhaps I was too quick in the mention. My interest in this area started with my editing a book in over a period of 2 years, began in 2015, which was a book biography of a man called A.C.N. Nambiar, who was the husband of Suhasini Nambiar, whose picture we have seen in this talk. And A.C.N. Nambiar was a Berlin-based journalist, and he was connected to these revolutionary networks, and he was quite a fascinating character. And the book was written by a former Indian intelligence officer, Mr. V. Balchandran, who actually was a personal friend of Nambiar. So Mr. Balchandran's own association with A.C.N. Nambiar was really quite fascinating. And I was very drawn to the book, primarily because of Mr. Balchandran's association with Nambiar. Thereafter, I conducted some additional research for the book, traveling to Delhi for some documents to be looked at the Nehru Memorial Museum Library. And so from that point onwards, I've been very interested in this period of anti-colonialism because of the lives of those people who have been mentioned in this talk, including Suhasini Nambiar, A.C.N. Nambiar, Suhasini's oldest brother, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, M.N. Roy, of course, who I've written about recently. So that's how the journey started. It's 2015, and I've been interested in this, and I've been looking at sources from various archives, some in India, some abroad. Of course, there's other scholarship to be had. Other people have written on these figures, but the wealth of information that has come, in particular with the Suhasini Nambiar episode, as I mentioned, came from the Bombay Police Special Branch archives, which Mr. Balchandran had accessed during his period of research. Those documents proved to be wonderfully rich and revelatory.
Tell us, Gautam, you mentioned the Bombay Chronicle. How did the, shall we say, the pro-establishment newspapers look at all of this? How did the Times of India report this? How did the Statesman, for instance, report it in Calcutta?
That's a very good question. I haven't deeply looked into the reporting of, although I have read reports about the arrests and the Meerut conspiracy trial and in passing. The establishment, of course, many of these newspapers, broadly speaking here, although there was quite a variety of reporting, I might add, were reporting on the trial quite close to the establishment line. But what we do know, of course, is that there was a great fear of the communist presence in India. So there was a legitimate concern that communists would cause a lot of unrest. They would kind of skew the political landscape. And many of the nationalist figures also were very uncomfortable with the association of the communists. Of course, within the Congress itself, there was a left-wing faction. But Jawaharlal Nehru, for instance, was quite sympathetic, although he was a Fabian socialist in a political sense. But he, of course, met all these figures, including M.N. Roy and other kinds of figures, and he was associated with them. So he, in some sense, there was a balance to be struck between the left-wing factions of the nationalist movement and the ultra-left-wing communists who wished for a revolutionary movement were directed from Moscow. But of course, those changed quite quickly with the expulsion of M.N. Roy from Comintern and his eventual landing up in Bombay. So I would say broadly, to answer your question, that the Times of India, Statesman, and other newspapers, generally took a more closer line to the establishment's view and how and of the court proceedings and of the unfolding of the court proceedings.
There's a question from Sun Zoom. He wants to know what happened to the 40,000 migrants who went to Afghanistan.
Many of them came back to Peshawar. A lot of the Muhajirin, as they were known, immigrants, came back to Peshawar. Some of them, from what I know, I haven't read the literature on the Hijrat, as it was called, this event, of course, harking back to Islamic theology and all of that. But there were a certain number of people who remained. So many of them intended to join the war effort in solidarity with Turkey. Some of them, of course, a small motley crew, as I've explained here, ended up in Moscow. Many of them returned to India, and the Peshawar conspiracy case of 1922 was actually involved several of these figures who were arrested coming back from Tashkent.
You mentioned the British communists quite prominently. Was there any interaction with the Eastern world? Any with Southeast Asia? Any of these people were influenced by people from Southeast Asia?
Yes, I mean, a little later, they came into creation an organization called the League Against Imperialism. Jawaharlal Nehru, of course, was one of the delegates in the 1927 Brussels conference, the inaugural conference, and Muhammad Hatta and other figures from Southeast Asia. They were, I mean, I'm forgetting names now because I have not specifically prepared on the League Against Imperialism for this talk, but there was a sense, and there is also a good recent book by a British historian mapping these different figures who were connected in their revolutionary ideals across the world during this period. So yes, there were Southeast Asian figures. There were figures from other parts of other colonial colonized countries, and it's actually, like you mentioned at the outset, Farooq, it's a very, very fascinating period of mobility, and it's Bombay, of course, was central, a very prominent place in this global phenomena.
Would you say that the involvement of the communists in the trade union movement was a given? It was something which had to happen. And would you like to speculate on what would have happened if the communists had not got involved in the trade union movement? Is such a scenario likely?
That's a difficult question, but it's an interesting question also, because by the early 20s, we know that there were extremely strong union leaders across the country, and trade unions began making their presence felt. There's a lot of scholarship and documentation about the amount of strikes. Data on the number of strikes were kept quite diligently by colonial authorities during that period. So trade union activity was very, very strong during that period. Of course, post the First World War, there was, and the Great Depression, there was like a economic distress. So the mill workers suffered greatly and mills suffered greatly because of those global events. So I think it was in some sense inevitable because of the grand ideological nature of communism and the People's Movement and the Russian Revolution, and the sort of infusion of messages and solidarities that was taking place in the early 20s, where the idea of challenging colonial authorities and challenging colonial oppressors and other oppressors, capitalist oppressors, and the value and the ideals of people's movements, they started coalescing quite interestingly. Mm-hmm. So it was quite a natural fit for those times. And of course, we must not forget that money and resources and men and propaganda had a huge part to play. And M.N. Roy was at the center of this, amongst other figures. So I would imagine, in a speculative sense, I would imagine they would have been other kinds of radical activities and radical associations. Maybe they would have been, radicalism coming out of the nationalist movement that aligned with the trade unions. That also happened, of course. Royism became much later after Roy came, became separate from CPI. So yes, I mean, they could certainly, I would imagine that there could be a scenario, it's well within the realm of possibilities, that other kinds of radical entities and formations and solidarities would have taken shape.
Great. Gautam, that brings us to the end of the questions. Thank you so much for sparing your time. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much
everybody.
for hosting me. Thank you very much. And thanks
Pleasure.
to everyone for coming in to listen to this. Thank you.